476 AD, the city of Ravenna, Italy. For centuries, the Roman Empire was more than just a government. It was the very architecture of reality for anyone living in the West. It was the concept of order, the certainty of law, and the sheer, overwhelming weight of an empire that stretched from the sun-drenched sands of North Africa to the misty forests of Britannia. But as the 5th century draws to a close, that reality is shattering. The monolithic structure that once held the known world together is not merely cracking, it is collapsing into 1,000 jagged pieces. To understand the chaos that is about to consume Europe, we must first understand that Rome did not fall in a single night. There was no cinematic explosion, no sudden curtain call. Instead, it was a slow, agonizing decay, a systemic rot that hollowed out the empire from within long before the final blow was struck. The causes were a lethal cocktail of instability. Economically, the empire was bleeding. Hyperinflation had rendered the currency nearly worthless, and the crushing weight of taxation to fund a massive, bloated military had pushed the peasantry to the brink of starvation. Politically, the leadership was a revolving door of assassination and civil war. Emperors rose and fell like autumn leaves, often reigning for mere months before being replaced by the next general with a larger army. But while Rome bled internally, the borders were being hammered from without. The Pax Romana, the Roman peace, was being replaced by a period of relentless pressure. The Great Migration was no longer a distant threat. It was a tidal wave. Driven by the terrifying advance of the Huns from the east, Germanic tribes like the Goths, the Vandals, and the Franks were being pushed into Roman territory. They were not merely raiding. They were seeking survival, and they were bringing their own kings, their own gods, and their own ambitions with them. The symbolic end came when the Germanic chieftain Odoacer deposed the young, hapless Emperor Romulus Augustulus. When the crown was sent to Constantinople, it was a signal to the world. The Western Roman Empire, as a political entity, had ceased to exist. What followed was a period of profound, terrifying disorientation. The great Roman roads, once the arteries of commerce and communication, became paths for marauding warbands. The sophisticated bureaucracy that managed grain supplies and tax collection vanished, leaving cities to starve and trade to wither. The sense of a unified, civilized world evaporated, replaced by a fractured landscape of localized power and constant insecurity. For the people living through it, it felt as though the sun was setting on civilization itself. The light of classical learning, of Roman law, and of urban life began to dim, casting long, uncertain shadows across the continent. The Mediterranean, once a Roman lake, was becoming a contested zone of warring factions. But as the old structures crumbled, the vacuum left by Rome would not remain empty for long. Out of the smoke and the wreckage of the fallen empire, new peoples were beginning to find their footing, and the chaos of the collapse would soon give way to a frantic, violent, and transformative movement of entire nations. The world was changing, and the great migration of peoples was only just beginning. 376 AD. The banks of the Danube River on the frontier of the Roman Empire. For centuries, the borders of Rome were more than just lines on a map. They were a dam holding back a sea of tribal movement. But in the late 4th century, the dam began to crack. From the dark, sweeping plains of Central Asia, a new and terrifying force was moving westward, the Huns. They were a nomadic whirlwind of horse and bow, a people whose arrival sent a shockwave through the Germanic tribes living along the Roman borders. This was not an invasion in the sense of a coordinated military campaign. It was something far more chaotic, far more human, and far more transformative. It was the beginning of the Verlkerwanderung asterisk, the migration period. Driven by the relentless pressure of the Huns, entire nations were uprooted. We are not talking about small raiding parties, but entire populations, men, women, children, and livestock, moving in a desperate, rolling tide toward the warmth and stability of the Roman provinces. To the Romans, these were barbarians, but to the tribes themselves, this was a struggle for survival. First came the Goths. Divided into the Visigoths and the Ostrogoths, they pushed through the Danubian defenses, seeking refuge and land within the empire's embrace. They were followed by a kaleidoscope of other peoples: the Vandals, the Suebi, the Alans, and the Burgundians. Each group brought with them their own languages, their own gods, and their own warrior traditions. As these tribes spilled across the Rhine and the Danube, the Roman administrative machine began to seize up. The empire, once a monolithic superpower, found itself unable to manage the sheer scale of the movement. Some tribes sought to integrate, serving as foederati allied soldiers who fought for Rome in exchange for land. But others sought to conquer. The movement was a slow-motion collision. As the tribes moved south and west, they did not merely destroy, they occupied. They carved out pockets of influence within the Roman landscape, setting the stage for the fragmented map of Europe we recognize today. The Vandals would eventually cross the Mediterranean to strike at North Africa. The Visigoths would descend upon Italy and eventually settle in Hispania. And the Franks would begin their slow, methodical rise in the fertile lands of Gaul. This was a period of profound darkness, yes, but it was also a period of intense, violent creation. The old Roman order, the centralized law, the unified currency, the singular Mediterranean identity, was dissolving. In its place, a new, hybrid culture was being forged in the fires of migration. It was a fusion of Roman administrative remnants and Germanic tribal customs. The map of Europe was being redrawn, not by the pens of diplomats, but by the feet of millions in motion. The borders of the ancient world were vanishing, replaced by the ancestral territories of the peoples who would become the foundations of modern Europe. The Roman sun was setting, and in the twilight, the tribes were moving into the light of a new, uncertain age. 500 AD, the forests and river valleys of Gaul. As the grand architecture of Rome crumbled and its administrative grip slipped away, Europe was not merely falling into chaos. It was being reborn in a crucible of blood and iron. In the vacuum left by the retreating legions, a collection of fractured Germanic tribes scrambled for dominance. Among them, one group would emerge not just as conquerors, but as the foundational architects of Western Europe, the Franks. The story of the Merovingian dynasty is one of myth meeting brutal reality. Legend tells us of a divine connection, tracing the lineage back to a semi-mythical figure named Merovich. Whether a god or a mere warlord, the name became a brand of legitimacy. To be a Merovingian was to possess a sacred right to rule, a concept that would bind the Frankish identity to a sense of destiny. But destiny in the 5th and 6th centuries was forged through conquest. The rise of the Franks was personified by a man of terrifying ambition. Clovis I before Clovis, the Franks were a loose confederation of tribes, often at odds with one another. Clovis changed the calculus of power. Through a combination of tactical brilliance and ruthless elimination of rival chieftains, he unified the Salian Franks and pushed deep into the heart of Gaul. However, Clovis understood something that many of his contemporaries did not. Power is fleeting if it is not sanctified. In a masterstroke of political maneuvering that would alter the course of history, Clovis converted to Nicene Christianity. This was not merely a personal spiritual journey, it was a geopolitical revolution. By embracing the faith of the Gallo-Roman population, Clovis bridged the gap between the Germanic conquerors and the Romanized subjects they ruled. He transformed the Franks from foreign invaders into the defenders of the Church. This alliance between the Frankish sword and the Christian cross created a symbiotic relationship that would define the European Middle Ages for a millennium. Under the Merovingians, the map of Europe began to take its first recognizable shape. The Frankish realm expanded, absorbing much of what we now know as France and Germany. They established a kingdom that was neither purely Roman nor purely Germanic, but something entirely new, a hybrid civilization. Yet this dawn was shadowed by the very nature of their rule. The Merovingians practiced a form of succession that was as chaotic as it was traditional. The kingdom was treated as the private property of the royal family, divided among sons upon a king's death. This led to a cycle of fratricide, civil war, and the fragmentation of authority. As the dynasty grew weaker, consumed by its own bloodlines, a new class of administrators began to rise in the shadows, the mayors of the palace. The Merovingian era provided the essential scaffolding for Europe. They brought order to the ruins of Gaul, they fused the old Roman world with the new Germanic spirit, and they established the precedent of the Christian monarchy. But as the long-haired kings of the Merovingian line faded into decadence and irrelevance, the stage was being set for a new, more disciplined power to rise from within their own court. The dawn was over. The era of the great empires was about to begin. 330 AD, Constantinople. While the western half of the Roman Empire began to fracture under the weight of internal corruption and relentless tribal migrations, a different story was unfolding in the east. As the fires of chaos consumed Rome, Gaul, and Hispania, a beacon of ancient order continued to burn on the shores of the Bosphorus. This was not merely a remnant of a fallen empire. It was the survival of the Roman soul, reimagined, fortified, and transformed. To understand the early Middle Ages, one must realize that the fall of Rome was a tale of two halves. While the West descended into a mosaic of Germanic kingdoms, the East, which we now call the Byzantine Empire, remained a sophisticated, centralized superpower. It possessed what the West had lost: a professional bureaucracy, a standing army, a unified legal code, and a staggering wealth that flowed through the silk and spice routes of the Mediterranean. The survival of this Eastern Roman state was not guaranteed. It required more than just gold. It required the genius of men like Justinian the Great. In the 6th century, Justinian looked westward with longing, attempting to reclaim the lost provinces of Italy and Africa. His reign saw the monumental codification of Roman law, the Corpus Juris Civilis Asterisk, a legal masterpiece that would eventually form the bedrock of modern European jurisprudence. He also sought to mirror the glory of heaven on earth through architecture, commissioning the Hagia Sophia, a structure of such scale and light that it seemed to defy the very laws of physics. But Byzantium was more than just a political entity. It was a cultural fortress. As the Germanic tribes in the West were slowly being Christianized, Byzantium was already a deeply Christianized state, where the lines between emperor and church were inextricably blurred. The emperor was not merely a political leader. He was God's vicegerent on earth, the protector of the Orthodox faith. This fusion of Caesaropapism ensured that even when the empire faced existential threats. Its identity remained unshakable. However, this survival came at a cost. To maintain its borders, Byzantium became a sophisticated machine of diplomacy and warfare. It mastered the art of playing enemies against one another, using its immense wealth to bribe invaders or fund distant allies. Yet, as the centuries progressed, the empire found itself caught in a tightening vice. To the east, the rise of the Sassanid Persians, and later, the sudden and explosive expansion of the Islamic caliphates would test the Roman endurance to its absolute limit. As we look at the map of the 6th and 7th centuries, we see a stark dichotomy. In the West, the old Roman roads were falling into disrepair, and the literacy of the masses was fading into the shadows of local feudalism. But in the East, the lights of Constantinople, Antioch, and Alexandria remained bright. Byzantium served as the great repository of classical knowledge, preserving the Greek philosophy, science, and literature that the West would one day rediscover during the Renaissance. The shadow of Byzantium loomed large over the developing West. It was a constant reminder that the Roman world had not truly died. It had simply moved, waiting in the East, a shimmering, golden specter of a past that refused to fade. 632 AD, the Arabian Peninsula. For centuries, the Mediterranean Sea had been a Roman lake, a vast blue highway that bound the shores of Europe, North Africa, and the Levant into a single, cohesive economic and political sphere. But as the shadows of the old Roman world lengthened, a new force was coalescing in the deserts of Arabia. Following the death of the prophet Mohammed, a rapid and unprecedented expansion began. This was not merely a series of raids. It was a tidal wave of faith, commerce, and conquest that would forever alter the trajectory of Western history. By the mid-7th century, the Islamic caliphates had achieved what seemed impossible. In a matter of decades, they had dismantled the Sassanid Empire of Persia, and more crucially for the fate of Europe, had shattered the southern reaches of the Byzantine Empire. The fertile lands of Egypt, the Levant, and North Africa, the very breadbaskets that had once fed the Roman world, fell under the banner of Islam. As the borders of the caliphate pushed toward the Iberian Peninsula, the Mediterranean underwent a fundamental metamorphosis. It was no longer a bridge connecting a unified Mediterranean world. It had become a frontier. A profound geopolitical rift opened up, dividing the sea into a Christian north and a Muslim south. The seamless flow of trade, culture, and people that had defined antiquity was severed. For the emerging kingdoms of Europe, the Mediterranean was no longer a welcoming highway, but a contested borderland, a zone of tension and religious friction. However, to view this era solely through the lens of conflict would be to miss one of the most significant cultural shifts in human history. While the political landscape was fracturing, a new intellectual and economic vitality was surging through the Islamic world. As the caliphates established themselves in cities like Damascus, Baghdad, and later Cordoba, they became the custodians of ancient knowledge. While much of Western Europe entered a period of localized, rural existence, the Islamic world was experiencing a golden age. Through the vast networks of the Caliphate, Greek philosophy, Indian mathematics, and Persian administration were being preserved, translated, and most importantly expanded upon. This Mediterranean shift meant that the center of gravity for science, medicine, and mathematics had moved eastward. The sophisticated systems of irrigation, new crops, and advanced navigational techniques introduced by Muslim scholars would eventually filter back into Europe, acting as a slow-burning fuse for future developments. In the West, the sudden loss of Mediterranean connectivity forced a period of painful introspection and restructuring. The Frankish kingdoms and the remnants of the Roman West were increasingly pushed toward the interior of the continent, looking toward the forests of Gaul and the Rhine rather than the shores of the south. The Mediterranean was becoming a barrier, a wall of water separating two distinct civilizations. This era of expansion and division set the stage for the centuries of friction and fascination that would follow. The encounter between the rising Islamic powers and the fragmented Christian kingdoms would define the religious, military, and cultural tensions of the Middle Ages, ultimately sparking the era of the Crusades and shaping the very identity of the European continent. C. 330 AD, the Mediterranean coast. As the grand administrative machinery of the Roman Empire began to fracture under the weight of internal decay and external pressure, a different kind of revolution was quietly taking root. It was not a revolution of swords or emperors, but one of the spirit. This was the emergence of monasticism, a movement that would become the unlikely life raft for Western civilization. As the classical world descended into what many would later call the Dark Ages, the urban centers of Rome and Alexandria began to dim. The roads fell into disrepair, the central bureaucracies dissolved, and the sophisticated literacy of antiquity began to flicker like a dying candle. In this vacuum of authority, a new kind of institution began to rise: the monastery. At first, these were not the massive, stone-walled fortresses of the later Middle Ages. They began as a radical rejection of the world, driven by the desire for ascesis asterisk, a disciplined struggle for spiritual perfection. Ascetics fled to the deserts of Egypt or the dense, untamed forests of Gaul. They sought solitude, seeking to find God in the silence that the collapsing Roman cities could no longer provide. However, as the chaos of the migration period intensified, these isolated hermitages evolved. The rugged individualism of the Desert Fathers gave way to organized communal living. Under the influence of figures like Saint Benedict of Nursia, the rule of Saint Benedict provided a blueprint for stability. It introduced a rhythmic, disciplined life governed by ora et labora asterisk, prayer and work. This structure was vital. In a world defined by unpredictable violence and shifting borders, the monastery offered something rare: permanence. While the Germanic kings fought to establish new kingdoms and the frontiers of Europe were redrawn by the movement of tribes, the monks were engaged in a different kind of conquest: the conquest of the written word. Within the cool, quiet walls of the scriptorium, the monks became the guardians of memory. As the secular schools of the Roman era vanished, the monasteries became the sole repositories of human knowledge. Here, by the flickering light of tallow candles, monks painstakingly copied not only the Holy Scriptures but also the works of Virgil, Cicero, and Aristotle. They preserved the Latin language, the very thread that would eventually stitch the disparate cultures of Europe back together. Without the monastic scriptorium, the intellectual heritage of Greece and Rome might have been lost to the dust of history. The monks were more than just religious devotees. They were the librarians of a dying world and the architects of the next. They transformed the monastery into a center of agricultural innovation, medical knowledge, and literacy, creating islands of order in a sea of tribal upheaval. As we move forward, we see that this preservation was not merely an act of piety, but an act of survival. The monastic tradition provided the cultural bedrock upon which the next great era of Europe would be built. It prepared the way for a resurgence of learning and a new kind of empire, one that would not be built on the strength of legions, but on the strength of a unified Christian identity. And that identity would find its greatest expression in the rise of a man who would attempt to forge a broken continent into a single, holy empire. Rome, 800 AD. The air inside Old St. Peter's Basilica is thick with the scent of incense and the heavy weight of expectation. As the bells toll, a man kneels before the altar, his armor clanking softly in the silence. This is not merely a religious ceremony. It is a seismic shift in the tectonic plates of European history. When Pope Leo III places the imperial crown upon the head of Charles, King of the Franks, he is not just honoring a man, he is resurrecting an idea. To understand the magnitude of this moment, we must look back at the man himself. Charles, known to history as Charlemagne, was a figure of gargantuan proportions. He was a Frankish warrior king who inherited a fragmented realm and transformed it into a sprawling empire that stretched from the Pyrenees to the Elbe and from the North Sea to the Italian peninsula. He was the successor to Clovis, the man who had unified the Frankish tribes, but Charles would achieve something far more profound: the unification of the Germanic spirit with the Roman legacy and the Christian faith. For decades, Charles had been the hammer of Christendom. His reign was defined by near-constant warfare. He campaigned against the Saxons in the north, a brutal and protracted struggle that sought to forcibly bring pagan tribes into the fold of the Church. He pushed against the Lombards in Italy and fought the Avars in the east. Through blood and iron, he carved out a new map of Europe. But Charles knew that an empire held together only by the sword would eventually shatter. He needed a foundation stronger than conquest. He needed legitimacy. By accepting the title of Imperator Romanorum Emperor of the Romans, Charles bridged the gap between the fallen antiquity of the West and the burgeoning Middle Ages. This was the birth of the Holy Roman Empire. It was a revolutionary concept, a political entity where the authority of the state was inextricably linked to the authority of the Church. For the first time since the collapse of the Western Roman Empire in 476, a single figurehead stood as the protector of the faith and the sovereign of the West. This union between the crown and the mitre changed everything. It gave Europe a sense of shared identity, a concept of Christendom that transcended local tribal loyalties. However, this marriage was also fraught with tension. The coronation set a precedent for the complex, often volatile relationship between popes and emperors, a struggle for supremacy that would define European politics for centuries to come. Charles was more than a conqueror. He was the architect of a new social order. His administrative reforms, his efforts to standardize laws, and his patronage of the clergy created the structural scaffolding upon which medieval society would be built. He was the bridge between two worlds. As the sun set on the chaotic migrations of the early Middle Ages, the reign of Charlemagne signaled the dawn of a structured, organized, and deeply religious European civilization. The empire he built would be unstable, and his successors would fight over its remains, but the blueprint he drafted, the synthesis of Roman tradition, Christian doctrine, and Germanic strength, would remain the heartbeat of Europe for a millennium. Circa 780 AD, at the court of Aachen. For much of the preceding centuries, the light of classical antiquity had been flickering, struggling to stay alight amidst the fragmentation of the post-Roman world. Literacy was a rare commodity, largely confined to the isolated cells of Benedictine monks, and the Latin language itself had begun to fracture, drifting into various regional dialects that made communication across borders nearly impossible. But as Charlemagne's empire expanded across much of Western Europe, a profound realization took hold of the great king. An empire held together by the sword alone would eventually shatter. To truly unite his diverse subjects, Franks, Saxons, Lombards, and Bavarians, he needed more than conquest. He needed a common culture, a common language, and a common faith. This realization ignited what historians call the Carolingian Renaissance. It was not a rebirth of art in the sense of the later Italian Renaissance, but rather a massive, state-sponsored project of preservation and standardization. Charlemagne understood that if the church was to function as the spiritual glue of his empire, its clergy had to be educated. If the laws were to be administered fairly, they had to be written clearly. To achieve this, the king turned to the greatest minds of his age. He reached out across the borders of his realm to recruit scholars, most notably Alcuin of York, a brilliant English monk who became the architect of this intellectual revival. Under Alcuin's guidance, the palace school at Aachen became a magnet for the era's most profound thinkers. They did not just study theology. They revived the asterisk trivium and the quadrivium asterisk, the classical liberal arts of grammar, rhetoric, logic, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. One of the most enduring legacies of this movement was the invention of Carolingian minuscule. Before this period, handwriting was often a chaotic, cramped, and difficult-to-read affair, varying wildly from one scriptorium to the next. The Carolingian scholars developed a new, standardized script characterized by clear, rounded letters, and crucially, the introduction of spaces between words. This made reading faster and more accessible, ensuring that a manuscript written in Gaul could be easily read by a scholar in Germania. This era also saw a monumental effort in the scriptoria of monasteries. Monks worked tirelessly, not just to write new texts, but to copy the surviving works of Roman authors, Cicero, Virgil, and Horace. Without the diligent hands of these Carolingian scribes, much of the classical literature we possess today would have been lost to the decay of time. They were the bridge, preserving the embers of the ancient world so they might one day burn bright again. Yet this revival was not merely an academic exercise. It was a political tool. By standardizing the Latin liturgy and the written word, Charlemagne was creating a unified European identity. He was weaving a tapestry of shared intellectual and spiritual values that transcended tribal lineages. The Carolingian Renaissance proved that while empires might rise and fall through military might, it is the preservation of knowledge and the standardization of culture that truly builds a civilization. But even as this intellectual flowering took root, a new shadow was stretching across the horizon, one that no amount of learning could hold back. June 793 A.D., the Lindisfarne Monastery, off the rocky coast of Northumbria. To the monks praying in the salt-sprayed silence of this holy sanctuary, the world was a place of divine order and predictable cycles. But that order was shattered in a single morning of blood and fire. From the gray horizon of the North Sea emerged dragon-headed ships, moving with a speed and grace that defied the heavy, clunky vessels of the West. These were not just ships. They were instruments of a new kind of terror. The Vikings had arrived. For centuries, the Germanic tribes of Scandinavia had lived in the fringes of the known world, isolated by fjords and frozen coasts. But as the climate shifted and the population grew, a new energy, or perhaps a new desperation, pushed these seafaring warriors outward. They were not a monolithic empire, but a collection of fiercely independent raiders, traders, and explorers, driven by a culture that placed immense value on martial prowess, lineage, and the pursuit of wealth. The technological edge of the Viking Age lay in the longship. With its shallow draft, the longship could navigate the deep Atlantic, yet also glide up the narrowest, shallowest rivers. This meant that no settlement was truly safe. A village tucked deep within a river valley, thought to be protected by miles of inland terrain, could find itself under siege before the morning bells had even ceased ringing. The initial phase of the Viking Age was defined by hit-and-run tactics. The Northmen targeted the softest, wealthiest points of European society, coastal monasteries. These sites were repositories of gold, silver, and fine textiles, and they were often undefended by standing armies. To the terrified Christian populations of Europe, the Vikings seemed less like men and more like a divine punishment, a whirlwind of axes and shields sent to scourge a sinful world. However, as the 9th century progressed, the nature of the Viking threat evolved. The raiders became settlers. They realized that the fertile lands of Francia, Anglo-Saxon England, and the river valleys of Russia were far more valuable than the occasional haul of church silver. In the Frankish territories, they carved out the Duchy of Normandy, a name that would forever link the Viking bloodline to the heart of European nobility. In England, the great heathen army moved from seasonal raiding to systematic conquest, challenging the very existence of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Yet to view the Vikings solely as engines of destruction is to miss the complexity of their legacy. They were also the world's premier navigators. While much of Europe remained inward-looking, the Vikings were crossing the Atlantic, reaching the shores of Iceland, Greenland, and even the mysterious lands of North America. They established vast trade networks that stretched from the icy north to the markets of Byzantium and the Abbasid Caliphate, bringing silk, spices, and silver into the northern reaches. The Viking Age fundamentally altered the landscape of Europe. It forced kingdoms to consolidate, spurred the fortification of cities, and accelerated the development of naval technology. As the terror from the north eventually settled into integration, the raiders became part of the very fabric of the societies they once pillaged. But for a century and a half, they remained the shadow over the West, a relentless maritime storm that redefined the boundaries of the medieval world. 895 AD, the Pannonian Basin. While the Vikings had long terrorized the northern coasts, and the shattered remnants of the Carolingian Empire struggled to maintain order in the West, a new, terrifying shadow was stretching across the heart of Europe. From the vast, untamed steppes of Central Asia, a nomadic people known as the Magyars had descended upon the Carpathian Basin. Unlike the Germanic tribes of old, who often sought land to settle and farm, the Magyars were masters of the horse and the composite bow. They were a whirlwind of light cavalry, moving with a speed that the heavy, slow-moving infantry of Europe could rarely match. Their incursions were not merely raids. They were lightning strikes of chaos. They swept through Germany, Italy, and France, leaving a trail of scorched villages and looted monasteries in their wake. For the people of the 10th century, the Magyars were an apocalyptic force, a celestial punishment sent to test a fragmented Christendom. They struck with precision, vanished before a counterattack could be organized, and retreated back into the safety of the plains, leaving the fractured kingdoms of Europe paralyzed by fear. But as the Magyars brought chaos from the east, a different kind of pressure was mounting from the south. 850 AD, the Mediterranean Basin. The world of late antiquity had been irrevocably altered by the rapid expansion of Islam. To the medieval European mind, the Saracens, a term used to describe the various Muslim forces of the era, represented a profound existential threat. This was not just a military challenge, but a clash of civilizations. The Mediterranean, once a Roman lake that facilitated trade and communication, had become a frontier of constant conflict. Saracen fleets, striking from North Africa and the Iberian Peninsula, haunted the coastlines of Italy, Sicily, and southern France. They were masters of naval warfare, conducting amphibious raids that bypassed the traditional defenses of landed knights. Coastal towns lived in a state of perpetual anxiety, building watchtowers and fortified walls to protect against sudden seaborne invasions. In the south, the struggle was for the very soul of the Mediterranean. In the north, it was a struggle for survival against the steppe. These dual incursions, the Magyars from the east and the Saracens from the south, created a unique period of intense insecurity. Europe was being squeezed. The central authority of the Carolingian era had dissolved, leaving a patchwork of local lords who were often too busy fighting one another to defend against external predators. Yet paradoxically, this era of terror became the crucible in which the Middle Ages would be forged. The inability of kings to provide protection forced local populations to look toward the only power capable of immediate response: the local warlord. This constant state of emergency accelerated the development of the feudal system. To survive the Magyar arrows and the Saracen sails, Europe needed a professional class of heavy cavalry, knights, and a localized, fortified social structure. The very threats that sought to tear Europe apart ultimately provided the pressure necessary to fuse its disparate parts into a new, defensive, and highly stratified social order. The chaos of the 10th century was not just an end, it was the violent birth of a new way of life. Circa 850 AD, the fractured landscapes of Western Europe. The dream of a unified empire under Charlemagne has withered. In its place, a terrifying reality has taken root. The horizon is no longer defined by the stable borders of a central state, but by the smoke of burning villages. To the north, the longships of the Vikings slice through the fog. From the east, the Magyar horsemen sweep across the plains. And from the south, the Saracens press against the frontiers. In this era of relentless insecurity, the old Roman concept of public authority, a government that protects all citizens through centralized law and standing armies, has effectively vanished. There is no central treasury to pay a professional soldier, and there are no distant legions coming to your rescue. Protection is no longer a right granted by a state. It has become a commodity, bought with land and blood. From this vacuum of power, the seeds of feudalism began to sprout. Feudalism was not a grand design conceived in a palace. It was a desperate, pragmatic response to chaos. It was a web of personal dependencies, a social contract written in the language of survival. At its heart was the relationship between the lord and the vassal. Imagine a local strongman, perhaps a count or a duke, who possesses the only means of defense in the region: armored cavalry and a fortified manor. This is the lord. He holds land, but he cannot defend it alone. To bolster his strength, he seeks out warriors. He offers these men a portion of his land, known as a asterisk fief asterisk, in exchange for a solemn oath of fealty. This was the act of homage. The vassal would kneel, place his hands between those of his lord, and swear to be his man. This was not merely a legal agreement. It was a sacred, ritualistic bond. In return for the fief, the vassal provided auxilium et concilium aid and counsel. Primarily, this meant military service. When the Viking raids came, the vassal was obligated to take up his sword and ride to his lord's side. In a world of constant raiding, this decentralized system of localized, private armies became the only shield against annihilation. But this pyramid of power required a foundation, and that foundation was built upon the backs of the peasantry. If the lords provided protection and the vassals provided military might, the vast majority of the population provided the sustenance that kept the entire machine turning. Enter the serf. Unlike the slaves of antiquity, who were considered mere property, the serf was bound to the land, not to a person. They were not to be bought or sold individually, but they could not leave the estate without permission. They were the heartbeat of the medieval economy. In exchange for a small plot of land to grow their own food and the physical protection of the lord's walls during a raid, the serfs surrendered their freedom. They labored in the lord's fields, paid taxes in grain and livestock, and lived under the jurisdiction of the manorial court. This was the tripartite structure of the Middle Ages: those who fought, those who prayed, and those who worked. It was a rigid, unequal, and often brutal hierarchy, but it was also a system of profound stability. In a world where the sky seemed to be falling, feudalism offered a grim, certain order. It turned the chaos of the collapse into a structured, albeit fragmented, way of life. Circa 850 AD, the heart of the Frankish kingdoms. To understand the Middle Ages, one must look past the gleaming armor of the knight and the gilded altars of the cathedral, and instead look down at the soil. If feudalism was the political skeleton of Europe, the manorial system was its very lifeblood. It was the economic engine that allowed the high politics of kings and lords to exist, fueled by the sweat, toil, and survival of the peasantry. Imagine, if you will, a landscape of isolation. In an era of fractured central authority and constant threat from Viking or Magyar raids, the world shrunk. For the vast majority of the population, the world was not a kingdom or an empire but the manor, a self-sufficient estate centered around a fortified manor house or a small castle, a village, and a sprawling patchwork of fields. The manor was a closed ecosystem. Because trade routes were perilous and currency was scarce, every community had to provide for its own needs. The manor held the mill to grind grain, the blacksmith to shoe horses, the oven to bake bread, and the woods for fuel. But this self-sufficiency came at a steep price: the loss of freedom. At the base of this hierarchy were the serfs. It is a common misconception that serfs were slaves. They could not be bought or sold individually like chattel. However, they were bound to the land. They could not leave the estate, marry, or sell their livestock without the permission of their lord. In exchange for a small plot of land to grow their own food and the promise of physical protection from marauders, the serf owed the lord their labor. This was the corvée, a system of compulsory labor. Several days a week, the serf would leave their own meager strips of land to work the domain, the lord's personal fields. They plowed, they sowed, and they harvested, ensuring the lord's granaries were full before their own families were fed. The geography of the manor was dictated by the open field system. Instead of consolidated farms, the land was divided into long, narrow strips. A single peasant family might hold several strips scattered across different fields, a method designed to ensure that no one person held all the fertile soil, while another held only the rocky earth. This required intense communal cooperation. Neighbors had to coordinate when to plow, when to plant, and when to harvest, creating a tightly knit, if highly regulated, social fabric. The rhythm of life was dictated by the seasons and the bells of the local parish church. Spring planting, summer weeding, autumn harvest, and the long, hungry lean of winter. It was a life of grueling physical hardship, dictated by the whims of weather and the heavy hand of manorial custom. Yet within this rigid structure, there was a profound sense of stability. The manorial system provided a predictable, if harsh, order in a world that often felt chaotic and violent. It was a social contract written in earth and grain. The peasant provided the bread, and the Lord provided the shield. As we move forward, we will see how this localized stability eventually gave way to a massive explosion of growth. As these very fields began to yield more than just survival, paving the way for the great expansion of the High Middle Ages. Circa 1000 AD, across the dense, untamed forests of northern and central Europe. For centuries, the landscape of Europe had been defined by isolation. Great swathes of ancient, primeval woodland and treacherous marshlands acted as natural barriers, keeping human settlements small, scattered, and deeply vulnerable. But as the first millennium turned, a profound transformation began to stir, a quiet, rhythmic revolution of the axe, the plow, and the soil. This was the era of the Great Clearing. To understand this explosion of life, we must first look beneath the earth. For much of the early Middle Ages, farming was a desperate struggle against scarcity. Farmers relied on the two-field system, leaving half their land fallow, empty and unproductive, each year to prevent the soil from exhausting itself. It was a cycle of subsistence that barely kept pace with hunger. But then a technological breakthrough arrived: the heavy, wheeled mold-board plow. Unlike the light scratch plows of the Mediterranean, which merely brushed the surface of thin soils, this new iron-tipped beast could bite deep into the thick, moist, clay-rich soils of northern Europe. It turned the earth over, aerating the soil and burying weeds, creating a fertile bed for crops that had previously been impossible to cultivate. This mechanical shift was paired with a biological one: the implementation of the three-field system. Instead of leaving half the land idle, farmers divided their acreage into three parts. One field was planted in the autumn with winter wheat or rye. A second was planted in the spring with peas, beans, or barley, and only the third remained fallow. This rotation did more than just increase food production. It introduced legumes, which fixed nitrogen back into the soil, naturally replenishing its strength, while providing a vital source of protein for the peasantry. The result was a caloric surplus. For the first time in generations, there was more food than there was immediate need for survival. And where there is food, there is life. As the bellies of Europe were filled, the population began to swell at an unprecedented rate. This demographic explosion acted like a rising tide, pushing against the boundaries of the known world. The Great Clearing was the physical manifestation of this pressure. Driven by a growing number of mouths to feed, entire communities moved toward the frontiers. Men, women, and children took up axes to fell the massive oaks and pines that had stood for centuries. They drained the swamps, reclaimed the marshes, and carved permanent, structured landscapes out of the wilderness. The wilderness was retreating, and in its place, a new map of Europe was being drawn. Small hamlets grew into sprawling villages. Villages expanded into fortified towns. The forest, once a place of mystery and danger, was being tamed into a grid of productive fields and managed pastures. This was not merely a change in scenery. It was a fundamental shift in the human condition. The surplus of food meant that not everyone had to be a farmer. A new layer of society was emerging, people who could specialize in crafts, trade, and administration. The foundations of the High Middle Ages were being laid not by the sword, but by the plow. The stage was set for a new era of complexity, wealth, and urban expansion, as the quiet rhythm of the harvest began to drive the heartbeat of a continent. Circa 1050 AD, the Rhine Valley, Holy Roman Empire. For centuries, the heartbeat of Europe was found in the silence of the countryside. Life was dictated by the rhythmic, grueling cycle of the manor, a world of soil, stone, and the rigid hierarchy of lord and serf. But as the 11th century unfolded, a profound transformation began to stir. The heavy plow, the horse collar, and the three-field system had done more than just fill bellies. They had created a surplus. And where there is surplus, there is trade. Where there is trade, there is movement. The quiet isolation of the feudal estate began to crack as surplus grain, wool, and wine flowed towards central points of exchange. Old Roman ruins, once abandoned to the weeds, were being reclaimed. Small settlements clustered around river crossings, fortified bridges and coastal ports began to swell, evolving from mere marketplaces into something entirely new, the medieval city. These were not merely collections of buildings. They were islands of freedom in a sea of feudal obligation. In the countryside, a man was bound to the land and his lord by birth and blood. But in the burgeoning urban centers, a different law began to take hold. There was a growing legal principle in many regions. Statluft macht frei asterisk, city air makes you free. It was whispered that if a runaway serf could live within the city walls for a year and a day without being claimed by his lord, he would earn his liberty. This shift gave rise to a new social phenomenon, the merchant class. For the first time since the fall of Rome, a middle layer of society was emerging. Men who owned no land, yet possessed something arguably more powerful, liquid wealth. They were the bourgeoisie, the dwellers of the asterisk burg asterisk. These merchants were the architects of a new interconnected Europe. They organized themselves into powerful guilds, secretive and highly structured associations that controlled the quality, price, and production of goods. A weaver's guild in Flanders or a goldsmith's guild in Florence held the power to make or break a local economy. These guilds provided more than just economic protection. They became the social glue of the city, offering charity to members, regulating training through apprenticeships, and even funding the construction of the great civic halls and cathedrals we still marvel at today. As trade routes expanded, so did the complexity of the world. The Mediterranean became a highway for spices and silks from the east, while the Hanseatic League turned the North and Baltic seas into a massive commercial network. Money, once a rarity, became the new language of power. Credit, banking, and letters of exchange were developed to move wealth across vast distances without the danger of carrying heavy chests of gold through bandit-ridden forests. This economic explosion fundamentally challenged the old feudal order. The nobility relied on land and military service. The merchants relied on capital and commerce. As cities grew, they demanded autonomy, often purchasing charters of freedom from cash-strapped kings and lords, granting them the right to self-govern, to hold their own courts, and to collect their own taxes. The landscape of Europe was no longer just a patchwork of manors. It was becoming a network of vibrant, pulsing urban hubs, centers of innovation, tension, and unprecedented wealth that would soon set the stage for a collision with the wider world. 1095 AD, Council of Clermont, France. The air in the assembly hall was thick with tension and religious fervor. When Pope Urban II stood before the gathered nobility and spoke of a desperate plea from the East, of Christians suffering under Seljuk Turk rule and the perceived desecration of the Holy Land, he did more than issue a call to arms. He ignited a fire that would consume the Mediterranean for 2 centuries. He promised the remission of sins to anyone who took up the cross, and in that moment, the concept of holy war was etched into the European psyche. This was the dawn of the Crusades, a series of massive, religiously motivated military expeditions that would force a violent, chaotic collision between the Latin West and the Islamic East. The First Crusade was a phenomenon of sheer, unorganized willpower. It was not merely an army of knights, but a tidal wave of peasants, pilgrims, and minor lords, driven by a mixture of genuine piety and the desperate hope for land and fortune. When they finally reached the walls of Jerusalem in 1099, the resulting conquest was a bloodbath that left an indelible scar on the memory of the Muslim world. From the wreckage of this victory, the Crusader states were born, small, fragile outposts of European feudalism, planted firmly in the heart of the Levant. But the Crusades were never a simple story of Christians versus Muslims. It was a complex web of shifting alliances, betrayal, and cultural osmosis. As the centuries progressed, the conflict evolved. The Second and Third Crusades saw the rise of legendary figures: the calculating Saladin, who unified the Muslim factions and reclaimed Jerusalem, and the chivalrous Richard the Lionheart, whose rivalry with Saladin became the stuff of epic legend. While the primary objective was often military and territorial, the unintended consequences of these expeditions were arguably more transformative than the battles themselves. As the armies marched through the Levant, they did more than carry swords, they carried ideas. The collision was not just one of steel, but of intellect and commerce. For a Europe that had spent centuries in relative isolation, the contact with the sophisticated civilizations of the East was a profound shock to the system. Through the Crusader states and the trading ports of the Mediterranean, much of what the West had lost during the Dark Ages began to flow back into Europe. They rediscovered the lost works of Greek philosophy, advanced mathematics, sophisticated medical knowledge, and the secrets of silk and spice production. The hunger for these Eastern luxuries would eventually drive the European merchant class to seek new routes, setting the stage for the Age of Discovery. Yet the legacy of the Crusades remains deeply polarized. To the West, they were a period of spiritual testing and the expansion of Christendom. To the East, they were seen as unprovoked invasions by barbarian outsiders. This era cemented a religious divide that would echo through the centuries, shaping the geopolitical tensions of the Middle East to this very day. The Crusades proved that the world was much larger and much more interconnected than the medieval mind had ever dared to imagine. It was a period of immense bloodshed, but also one of immense awakening, a violent bridge between the isolated manners of Europe and the vast, complex world beyond the horizon. 1140 AD, the Isle de France. For centuries, the churches of Europe had been defined by the Romanesque style: thick, heavy walls, small windows, and a sense of somber, grounded permanence. They were fortresses of faith, built to withstand both the elements and the chaos of a fractured world. But as the 12th century dawned, a profound transformation began to stir in the heart of France. It was as if the very stone itself sought to break free from the gravity of the earth. This was the birth of the Gothic era. It was not merely a change in architectural fashion. It was a theological revolution expressed through geometry and light. Driven by the philosophy of Abbot Suger at the Abbey of Saint-Denis, the goal was no longer to create a dark sanctuary of refuge, but to create a threshold of heaven. The objective was lux continua continuous light. To achieve this, medieval master builders had to master the physics of weight and tension. They moved away from the rounded arches of the past, introducing the pointed arch, which directed the immense weight of the roof more efficiently toward the ground. They perfected the ribbed vault, a skeletal framework of stone that allowed for much higher, more complex ceilings. But perhaps the most ingenious innovation was the flying buttress. By extending external stone supports away from the main walls, architects could redirect the outward thrust of the massive vaults. This technical breakthrough changed everything. Suddenly, the walls no longer had to be massive, load-bearing barriers. They could be opened up. They could be replaced by glass. As these cathedrals rose, Notre Dame de Paris, Chartres, Reims, and later, the soaring heights of Cologne, they became the beating hearts of the growing medieval cities. They were the most ambitious engineering projects the world had ever seen, often taking generations, sometimes even centuries, to complete. To walk into a Gothic cathedral was to experience a sensory overload designed to humble the soul and elevate the mind. Above, the dizzying heights of the nave drew the eyes upward, mimicking the ascent toward the divine. And through the vast expanses of stained glass, the dim religious light filtered in, transforming raw sunlight into a kaleidoscope of crimson, azure, and gold. These windows were more than mere decoration. They were the poor man's Bible. In an age where literacy was a luxury of the elite, the vibrant glass stories provided a visual liturgy, teaching the history of salvation to the illiterate masses through color and light. These structures were also civic triumphs. They were symbols of a new, prosperous Europe, a testament to the wealth of the merchant classes and the growing power of urban centers. They were communal endeavors, where the labor of stonemasons, carpenters, and glass blowers converged to create something that transcended the individual. Yet beneath the splendor, there was a tension. The Gothic cathedral was a paradox. It was an achievement of human mathematics and earthly labor, yet its entire purpose was to point toward the supernatural. It was a bridge between the mud of the medieval street and the brilliance of the celestial realm. As these stone giants continued to pierce the skyline of Europe, they stood as permanent monuments to a civilization that was no longer merely surviving, but was finally learning how to soar. 1200 AD, Paris. The air in the narrow, winding streets of the Latin Quarter is thick with the smell of parchment, tallow candles, and the heated debates of hundreds of young men. We have entered a new era of the human intellect. For centuries, the preservation of knowledge was a quiet, monastic affair. Learning was tucked away in the secluded scriptoriums of Benedictine monks, where the primary goal was not discovery, but the preservation of sacred texts. But as the High Middle Ages dawned, Europe underwent a profound transformation. Trade flourished, cities swelled, and a new class of people emerged, not just peasants and knights, but thinkers, lawyers, and clerks. The world was becoming too complex for the monastery alone to contain. This complexity birthed scholasticism. Scholasticism was not merely a subject of study, but a method of critical thought. It was a rigorous intellectual system that sought to reconcile two seemingly opposing forces: the revealed truths of Christian faith and the rediscovered logic of classical antiquity. The catalyst for this revolution was the influx of lost knowledge. Through the Crusades and contact with the Islamic world in Spain and Sicily, Europe was reintroduced to the works of Aristotle. For the first time in centuries, Western thinkers were confronted with a sophisticated, pagan system of logic that demanded to be understood. The challenge for the medieval mind was profound. How could one be a devout Christian while simultaneously embracing the rational, empirical logic of a Greek philosopher? The answer was found in the Disputatio Asterisk, the formal debate. Scholasticism moved away from the passive reading of texts toward a dialectical process. A scholar would pose a question, present the arguments for it, counter them with opposing views, and finally, use logic to reach a synthesis. It was a way of thinking that valued precision, definition, and the relentless pursuit of truth through reason. As this method took hold, the very structure of education began to shift. No longer were students merely wandering scholars seeking out a specific master. They began to congregate in organized groups. These groups sought legal protection, autonomy from local bishops, and the right to govern themselves. In cities like Bologna, Paris, and Oxford, these guilds of scholars evolved into something entirely new: the university. The university was a revolutionary institution. It was a corporation of learning, a self-governing body that provided a standardized curriculum of the 7 liberal arts, the trivium of grammar, logic, and rhetoric, followed by the quadrivium of arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. In these lecture halls, the seeds of the modern world were being sown. While the scholastics were deeply rooted in theology, their obsession with logic and categorization laid the groundwork for the systematic inquiry that would eventually define the scientific revolution. They taught Europe how to argue, how to categorize the natural world, and how to bridge the gap between what is believed and what can be proven. As the bells of the great Gothic cathedrals rang out over the growing urban centers, they signaled more than just a call to prayer. They signaled the rise of an intellectual class that would no longer look solely to the heavens for answers, but would begin to use the tools of human reason to map the complexities of the world below. The age of the monk was being joined, and eventually superseded, by the age of the scholar. 1200 AD, the courts of Western Europe. To look upon a knight in the High Middle Ages was to see more than just a man in steel. It was to see the embodiment of a complex, often contradictory social code. As the chaos of the early medieval centuries gave way to the stability of the High Middle Ages, the warrior class underwent a profound transformation. They were no longer merely the violent enforcers of a feudal lord's will. They were being reshaped into something more refined, something elevated. This was the birth of chivalry. Chivalry was never a single, written law, but rather a shifting tapestry of ethics that attempted to tame the inherent violence of the aristocratic warrior. At its core, it was a dual obligation, a duty to God and a duty to one's liege lord. The knight was expected to be a protector of the weak, a defender of the church, and a paragon of courage on the battlefield. To be chivalrous meant to possess largesse asterisk, a generous spirit, and prowess asterisk, the martial skill required to uphold his status. Through the rituals of knighthood, from the humble page to the celebrated squire, the violent energies of the landed nobility were funneled into a structured system of honor and service. However, as the knight became more integrated into the sophisticated courts of Europe, a second, more delicate layer of this identity emerged. The concept of courtly love, or asterisk finamur asterisk. If chivalry was the code of the battlefield, courtly love was the code of the banquet hall. Born from the troubadour traditions of Occitania and spreading across the continent, courtly love introduced a revolutionary psychological element to the medieval world. It was a highly stylized, often agonizingly formal system of devotion, usually directed toward a lady of higher social standing than the knight himself. In this literary and social dance, the knight did not seek to possess the lady through force, but to serve her through suffering and devotion. This religion of love demanded that the knight perform great deeds, not merely for glory, but to prove his worthiness to his lady. It transformed the rough-edged soldier into a poet, a singer, and a man of sensitivity. It introduced the idea that true nobility was found not just in the strength of one's arm, but in the refinement of one's spirit and the capacity for emotional discipline. Yet we must recognize the tension inherent in this ideal. Chivalry and courtly love were often in conflict. The knight was a man of blood, trained for the brutality of the crusade and the siege. Yet the court demanded he be a man of grace, capable of the subtle nuances of romance and etiquette. This duality created the romanticized image of the medieval hero that has persisted in our collective imagination for centuries. The warrior poet, the protector of the innocent, the lover of the unattainable. But as we move forward, we must ask, could such an idealized world truly last? As the 14th century approached, the grand castles and glittering tournaments would face a brutal reality check. The elegance of the court would soon be tested by the grim, unromantic necessities of a continent sliding toward catastrophe. 1315, Western Europe. For over a century, the continent had been breathing in rhythm with the earth. The High Middle Ages had been an era of expansion. Forests were cleared, new technologies like the heavy plow had unlocked the soil, and the population had swelled to unprecedented heights. Europe felt as though it had finally mastered the land. But nature, indifferent to the ambitions of kings and peasants alike, was about to reclaim its dominance. The prosperity of the 13th century was built on a fragile foundation, a period of unusually warm, stable weather known as the medieval warm period. This climatic stability had allowed for longer growing seasons and predictable harvests. By the early 1300s, Europe was crowded, overextended, and operating at the very limit of its ecological capacity. The margin for error had vanished. Then the skies turned. In the spring of 1315, a relentless, torrential rain began to fall across much of northern Europe. It was not a passing storm, but a seasonal shift that defied all known patterns. The rains did not stop for months, they bled into years. The sun, once the guarantor of life, became a rare visitor. The consequences were immediate and catastrophic. The soil, saturated and heavy, turned into a sodden mire. The seeds planted by desperate farmers simply rotted in the ground before they could ever take root. In the fields, the wheat and rye succumbed to fungal diseases like ergot, turning what little grain survived into something poisonous. Livestock fared no better. The constant dampness brought about murrain, a devastating cattle plague that decimated the oxen needed to plow the fields and the sheep needed for wool and meat. As the harvests failed, the fundamental machinery of medieval life ground to a halt. This was not merely a shortage of food, it was a total systemic collapse. In the cities, the price of grain skyrocketed beyond the reach of the working classes. When bread becomes a luxury, the social contract begins to fray. The famine did not strike all at once, but it arrived with a terrifying, creeping persistence. It hollowed out the population. It began with the hunger, a gnawing, constant ache that drove men to madness and desperation. It moved to the malnutrition, weakening the immune systems of entire generations. Children grew stunted, and the elderly succumbed to the sheer exhaustion of survival. We often think of the Middle Ages through the lens of grand battles and political intrigue, but the Great Famine was a silent, invisible killer. It stripped away the veneer of chivalry and stability, exposing the raw vulnerability of a civilization that had grown too large for its own resources. It was the first great crack in the edifice of the High Middle Ages. But as the rains finally began to subside, they left behind a continent that was physically and psychologically broken. The people were weakened, the economy was shattered, and the collective faith in the stability of the world was shaken to its core. Europe was a house primed for a disaster far more virulent than hunger. The famine had cleared the stage, leaving a starving, vulnerable population waiting for the next shadow to fall, a shadow that would arrive not in the form of rain, but in the form of a microscopic killer. 1347, the port of Messina, Sicily. A sight emerges from the Mediterranean haze that would signal the beginning of the end for the medieval world as it was known. Dozens of merchant galleys drift toward the docks, their sails tattered, their movements erratic. When the townspeople approach these vessels, they do not find riches or exotic spices. Instead, they find a nightmare. Sailors slumped over their oars, dead or dying, their bodies covered in grotesque blackened swellings known as buboes. This was the arrival of Yersinia pestis asterisk, the Black Death. To understand the scale of the catastrophe, we must understand the vulnerability of the 14th century. Europe had grown crowded. The High Middle Ages had brought a population boom, fueled by agricultural advances and a warming climate. But by the 1340s, the climate had turned, bringing torrential rains and failed harvests. The people were already weakened by the Great Famine. They were a continent on the brink, waiting for a spark. That spark was a flea, riding on the back of a black rat, carried along the very trade routes that had once brought prosperity to the Silk Road. As the plague moved from the Mediterranean into the heart of Europe, it moved with a terrifying supernatural speed. It bypassed walls, ignored social hierarchies, and defied the medical understanding of the age. Physicians, baffled by the invisible killer, prescribed bloodletting, aromatic herbs, and even flagellation, believing the pestilence was a divine punishment for human sin. None of it worked. The mortality rate was nothing short of apocalyptic. In many urban centers, half the population vanished in a matter of months. In some villages, the death toll was so absolute that not a single soul remained to bury the dead. The social fabric did not just tear, it disintegrated. The traditional rituals of death, the funeral processions, the prayers, the sanctity of the grave, were abandoned out of sheer terror and exhaustion. The psychological impact was a profound, collective trauma. How could a benevolent God allow such indiscriminate slaughter? The Church, the bedrock of medieval stability, found itself powerless. Priests died alongside their parishioners, and the inability of the clergy to halt the plague led to a creeping skepticism that would, centuries later, help fuel the Reformation. Yet amidst this sea of grief, the foundations of a new world began to shift. The sheer scarcity of human life fundamentally altered the economy. With the labor force decimated, the surviving peasantry suddenly held a leverage they had never possessed under the feudal system. They could demand higher wages. They could move to different lands. they could challenge the very concept of serfdom. The old contract between lord and vassal was broken by the sheer weight of the empty fields and silent manors. The Black Death was more than a biological event. It was a violent, cleansing fire. It swept away the excess of a crowded continent and left behind a landscape that was emptier, poorer, and deeply scarred. But in the vacuum left by the millions who perished, the rigid structures of the medieval order began to crack, making way for the radical transformations of the era to come. The old world was dying, and from its ashes, a different Europe would eventually rise. 1337 AD, the royal courts of Western Europe. What began as a dynastic dispute between cousins would spiral into a century of unprecedented devastation, fundamentally altering the landscape of the continent forever. To understand the Hundred Years' War, one must look to the complex web of feudal obligations that had long tied the English crown to the French throne. The English kings were not merely foreign invaders. They were, by law, vassals to the French kings for their lands in Aquitaine. But the tension reached a breaking point when the direct Capetian line in France failed. When Charles IV died without an heir, Edward III of England, the nephew of the deceased king, claimed the French throne for himself. The French nobility, unwilling to be ruled by an English monarch, pivoted to Philip VI, sparking a conflict that would be fought in waves, punctuated by long truces and even longer periods of bloodletting. The early decades of the war shattered the myth of the invincible armored knight. At the battles of Crécy and Poitiers, the traditional supremacy of the heavy cavalry was dismantled by a terrifying new force, the English longbow. These weapons, capable of raining arrows with devastating precision and speed, tore through the ranks of the French aristocracy, proving that tactical innovation could overcome social status and sheer numbers. For much of the 14th century, the war was a series of English victories, leading to the Treaty of Bretagne and a massive expansion of English territory in France. However, the war was not merely a series of battles. It was a war of attrition that bled the peasantry dry. As we have seen in this chapter, the Black Death had already weakened the social fabric, and the Hundred Years' War acted as a secondary plague. The tactic of the chevauchée asterisk, scorched earth raids designed to destroy the enemy's economic base, meant that for the common farmer, there was no distinction between the warring kings. Villages were burned, crops were destroyed, and the cycle of famine and violence became a permanent way of life. Yet, as the 15th century dawned, the momentum began to shift. The emergence of Joan of Arc, a peasant girl driven by divine visions, provided the French with something they had lacked for decades, a sense of national identity. She transformed a dynastic struggle between nobles into a holy crusade for the very soul of France. While her life was tragically short, her impact was seismic. She galvanized the French spirit, allowing leaders like Charles VII to modernize their military, utilizing early gunpowder artillery to reclaim lost territories. By the time the English were finally driven from the continent in 1453, the world of the High Middle Ages was dead. The war had accelerated the decline of feudalism. The knight was being replaced by the professional infantryman, and the king was becoming a centralized sovereign rather than a mere lord among lords. The conflict had forged the modern identities of England and France, turning them from collections of feudal fiefdoms into cohesive nation-states. But as the smoke cleared from the battlefields of France, a new era was beginning to stir, one not defined by the sword, but by the mind. For as the old structures of war crumbled, the light of a new intellectual movement was beginning to flicker in the Mediterranean, signaling the dawn of the Renaissance. 1309 AD, Avignon, France. To understand the crisis of the 14th century, one must understand that the heartbeat of Europe was not found in its palaces or its battlefields, but in the spiritual authority of the papacy. For centuries, the Pope was the undisputed moral compass of Christendom. But by the early 1300s, that compass began to spin wildly out of control. The seeds of this catastrophe were sown in a bitter struggle for supremacy between the papacy and the rising power of the French monarchy. When Pope Clement V, a Frenchman, was elected, the delicate balance between sacred authority and secular politics shattered. Rather than returning to the eternal city of Rome, the papal court moved to Avignon, a city nestled in the shadow of the Rhone River. This period, later branded by critics as the Babylonian captivity of the Church, saw 7 successive popes reside in France. To the people of Europe, the papacy no longer looked like a universal institution serving all of Christendom. It looked like a political puppet of the French crown. The splendor of the Avignon palaces, with their immense wealth and bureaucratic excess, stood in jarring contrast to the spiritual poverty and suffering felt by the common people, who were already reeling from the Great Famine and the creeping shadow of the Black Death. But the true fracture, the moment the Church truly broke, came not from the move to France but from the chaos that followed it. In 1378, after decades of French influence, a group of cardinals attempted to assert the independence of the Church by electing an Italian pope, Urban VI. However, the Roman populace, fearing French dominance, rioted, demanding a Roman, or at least an Italian, leader. Under intense pressure, the cardinals retreated and elected a rival pope, Clement VII, who returned to Avignon. Suddenly, Europe was no longer a unified spiritual body. It was a house divided against itself. The Great Schism had arrived. For nearly 40 years, the Christian world was split between 2, and eventually 3, competing claimants to the throne of St. Peter. This was not merely a theological debate, it was a geopolitical nightmare. Every kingdom in Europe was forced to choose a side. France and Scotland backed Avignon. England and the Holy Roman Empire backed Rome. The schism turned the sacred into the partisan, turning neighbors into heretics based entirely on the political allegiances of their monarchs. The psychological toll on the medieval mind was profound. If the Church, the very institution promised to hold the keys to heaven, could be so deeply corrupted by politics and fractured by ego, what hope was there for the individual soul? The divine order, which had been the bedrock of medieval life, appeared to be crumbling. The Avignon papacy and the subsequent schism did more than just weaken the office of the Pope. They sowed the seeds of profound skepticism. It created a vacuum of authority that would eventually be filled by the calls for reform, paving the way for the radical shifts in thought that would characterize the end of the Middle Ages. The Church had survived wars, famines, and plagues, but it was struggling to survive its own internal shadow. 1381, England. The air is thick with the scent of summer crops, but beneath the pastoral calm, a storm is brewing, one born not of weather but of desperation. To understand why the common man finally took up arms, we must look back at the devastation of the previous decade. The Black Death had swept through Europe, a silent reaper that claimed nearly half the population. For the survivors, the world had fundamentally changed. The scarcity of labor meant that, for the first time in history, the peasant held a shred of leverage. They demanded higher wages. They sought freedom from the restrictive bonds of serfdom. But the ruling elite, terrified by this shifting power dynamic, responded not with concessions but with repression. In England, the Statute of Labourers attempted to freeze wages at pre-plague levels, effectively trying to turn back the clock on economic reality. Then came the final insult, a series of regressive poll taxes, levied to fund the endless, draining conflicts of the Hundred Years' War. The tax fell equally on the rich and the poor, a crushing weight on those who had nothing left to give. In May 1381, the breaking point arrived. In the village of Brentwood, the spark was lit. What began as a localized protest against tax collectors quickly spiraled into a wildfire of insurrection. Led by figures like the radical priest John Ball, who famously asked, "When Adam delved and Eve spied, who was then the gentleman?" The rebels marched on London. This was no mere riot of hungry men. It was a sophisticated, ideological challenge to the very foundations of the feudal contract. The rebels moved with a terrifying purpose, targeting the symbols of their oppression: the lawyers, the tax collectors, and the high clergy. They burned manorial rolls, the legal documents that bound them to the land, and stormed the Tower of London, executing the Chancellor and the Archbishop of Canterbury. For a few feverish days, the hierarchy of England was turned upside down. The king, the young Richard II, was forced to meet them, offering promises of manumission and justice to quell the chaos. But the promises were a mirage. Once the immediate threat to the crown subsided, the state's vengeance was swift and merciless. The leaders were hunted down, tried, and executed. The rebellion was crushed, and on the surface, it appeared that the old order had triumphed. Yet the victory of the nobility was hollow. The revolt had signaled a tectonic shift in the European psyche. The myth of the natural order, the idea that God had ordained the peasant to serve and the lord to rule, had been shattered by the sheer force of the people's will. While the legal structures of feudalism remained, the economic reality had been irrevocably altered. Labor was now a commodity, and the peasant was no longer a mere fixture of the soil, but a participant in a much larger, much more volatile social drama. The fires of 1381 had died down, but the embers remained, smoldering beneath the surface of a continent that was rapidly losing its grip on the medieval past. The old world was dying, and from its ashes, the individual was beginning to emerge. 1350 AD, Western Europe. For centuries, the bedrock of European stability had been a silent, unspoken agreement, the feudal contract. It was a rigid hierarchical exchange of survival. In this world, the peasant provided labor and food, the knight provided protection and blood, and the lord provided land and law. It was a closed loop, a symbiotic relationship that had survived the collapse of Rome and the chaos of the Viking Age. But by the mid-14th century, the loop was not just fraying. It was being torn apart by the very forces of history. To understand the breakdown, we must first understand the catastrophe that preceded it. The Black Death had swept across the continent, a silent killer that claimed nearly half of the population. When the plague receded, it left behind a landscape that was fundamentally altered. Suddenly, the math of the medieval world had flipped. Where there was once a surplus of desperate laborers, there was now a desperate shortage of hands. For the first time in history, the peasant held the leverage. Survivors of the plague realized their labor was no longer a commodity to be taken, but a resource to be sold. They began to demand higher wages and better conditions. In many regions, they began to move, fleeing the traditional manners of their lords to seek better opportunities in the growing cities or on the estates of competing nobles. This was a direct violation of the feudal order, which relied on a stationary, bound workforce. When the nobility attempted to fight back, passing laws to freeze wages and restrict movement, they did not find submission. Instead, they found fury. This tension ignited into the social upheavals that defined the late 14th century, such as the Jacquerie in France and the Peasants' Revolt in England. These were not merely riots. They were the violent screams of a class realizing that the old protections of the feudal contract were no longer worth the price of their freedom. The lords could no longer guarantee the stability that justified their dominance, and the peasants no longer believed in the sanctity of their servitude. Simultaneously, the very nature of power was shifting. The Hundred Years' War had introduced a new, more expensive way of making history. The era of the armored knight, the quintessential figure of the feudal contract, was being eclipsed by the professionalization of warfare. The rise of infantry, the longbow, and eventually gunpowder meant that a king no longer needed to rely on the fickle, decentralized loyalty of 1,000 minor vassals. A monarch could now use tax revenue, collected from a growing merchant class, to hire mercenary armies. As kings began to centralize power, the middleman of the feudal lord became an expensive relic. The political landscape was transitioning from a web of personal, local oaths to the beginnings of the modern, centralized state. The bond of land was being replaced by the bond of coin and the authority of the crown. The feudal contract was built on the assumption of a static world, a world where people stayed where they were born and where death was a constant but manageable shadow. But with the plague, the war, and the rise of a money-based economy, the world had become too dynamic for the old chains to hold. The medieval structure was crumbling, making way for a more complex, more volatile, and ultimately more modern era. Florence, Italy, 1400. The air in the Italian city-states is thick with more than just the scent of the Arno River. It is thick with a new kind of electricity. For centuries, the European mind had been directed toward a single, unwavering horizon, the afterlife. In the medieval worldview, life on Earth was merely a testing ground, a fleeting, often painful prelude to the eternal glory of heaven. The individual was a small, humble cog in a vast, divine machinery, defined not by their own desires, but by their place in the great chain of being. But something is shifting. The heavy, incense-filled shadows of the Gothic era are beginning to recede, and in their place, a light is breaking through from the past. This is the dawn of the Renaissance, not merely a revival of art, but a fundamental revolution of the human spirit. At the heart of this transformation lies a single, radical concept: humanism. To understand humanism, one must look backward to look forward. Scholars, fueled by the wealth of rising merchant families like the Medici, are turning their eyes toward the lost treasures of classical antiquity. They are digging through monastic libraries and scavenging ancient ruins, unearthing the forgotten wisdom of Greece and Rome. But they aren't just looking for old stories. They are looking for a new way to live. The humanists, the asterisk studia humanitatis asterisk, argue that while God is the center of the universe, man is the most magnificent of his creations. They suggest that the human intellect, the capacity for reason, and the pursuit of beauty are not distractions from piety, but ways to honor the divine. This is a profound pivot. If the Middle Ages were characterized by the collective, the guild, the manor, the parish, The Renaissance is characterized by the individual. Suddenly, the person matters. The artist is no longer an anonymous craftsman decorating a cathedral. He is a genius seeking immortality through his brushstroke. The statesman is no longer just a servant of a lord, but a thinker studying civic virtue to build a better republic. Even the concept of fame begins to lose its sinful stigma, becoming instead a testament to human achievement. This new focus on the individual begins to reshape the very fabric of society. We see it in the portraiture of the era, where faces are no longer stylized, symbolic icons, but living, breathing human beings with depth, emotion, and psychological complexity. We see it in the way men begin to study rhetoric, history, and ethics, not just to serve the church, but to navigate the complexities of a rapidly expanding world. However, this shift is not without tension. The rise of the individual creates a friction with the old structures of feudalism and the absolute authority of the church. As man begins to trust his own eyes and his own reason, the unquestioned certainties of the medieval world begin to tremble. The individual is stepping out from the shadow of the cathedral and into the sunlight of the piazza. Europe is no longer just a collection of souls waiting for salvation. It is becoming a collection of minds seeking understanding. This awakening of the human ego is the spark that will soon ignite a fire, spreading from the streets of Florence to the furthest reaches of the continent, forever altering the trajectory of Western civilization. Mainz, Germany, around 1440. For centuries, the written word was a luxury of the elite, a sacred treasure locked away in the silent scriptoriums of monasteries or the private libraries of the ultra-wealthy. If you wanted a book, you had to wait months, perhaps years, for a monk to painstakingly transcribe it by hand onto expensive parchment made from animal skins. This was a world of scarcity. Knowledge was not a public utility. It was a controlled substance, held by the church and the aristocracy. Ideas traveled only as fast as a man could walk, and once a manuscript was lost or burned, the thoughts contained within it often vanished from human memory forever. But in the heart of the Rhineland, a goldsmith named Johannes Gutenberg was about to shatter this monopoly. Gutenberg's genius was not found in a single invention, but in the masterful synthesis of several. He took the mechanics of the wine press, used to squeeze juice from grapes, and reimagined it as a machine for pressing ink onto paper. He developed a sophisticated alloy of lead, tin, and antimony to create durable, uniform metal type. Most importantly, he perfected an oil-based ink that would cling to metal rather than bead off it. The result was movable type, a system where individual letters could be arranged, inked, pressed, and then redistributed to form a new page. It was the birth of mass production for the mind. The impact was immediate and seismic. When the Gutenberg Bible emerged in the mid-1450s, it signaled the beginning of a technological tidal wave. Suddenly, the cost of producing a book plummeted. What once took a year of manual labor could now be replicated in a matter of days. Books were no longer unique, fragile relics. They were becoming commodities. They were becoming portable. As printing shops spread from Mainz to Venice, Paris, and London, the very fabric of European society began to reweave itself. This was the democratization of information. For the first time in human history, an idea could be reproduced 1,000 times over, spreading across borders faster than any king or pope could suppress it. In the halls of the emerging universities, students no longer had to rely solely on the spoken word of a professor. They could hold the text in their own hands. In the streets, As literacy rates began their slow, steady climb, a new class of thinkers emerged, people who could read the scriptures, the laws, and the classical texts of the ancients for themselves. This was the engine of the Renaissance. The humanist movement, with its focus on individual potential and the study of Greek and Roman antiquity, found its greatest ally in the printing press. It fueled the fires of the Reformation, as Martin Luther's critiques of the Church were printed and distributed with a speed that left the ecclesiastical authorities breathless and bewildered. The printing press did more than just spread facts. It standardized language, stabilized grammar, and allowed for the accumulation of scientific data that could be verified by scholars hundreds of miles apart. It turned the solitary act of reading into a silent, global conversation. As the Middle Ages drew to a close, the press ensured that the darkness of ignorance could no longer be maintained. The monopoly on truth was broken, and the modern world, a world of shared knowledge and rapid intellectual evolution, was born. May 1453, Constantinople. For over 1,000 years, the city of Constantinople stood as the indestructible sentinel of the East. It was the queen of cities, a golden bridge between two continents and the final, flickering flame of the Roman Empire. While the Western Roman Empire had succumbed to chaos centuries earlier, the East, the Byzantine Empire, had endured, preserving the laws, the philosophy, and the Christian heritage of antiquity. But by the mid-15th century, that flame was nothing more than a guttering candle, surrounded by a rising tide of Ottoman power. The siege began in early spring. Sultan Mehmed II, a young and ambitious leader known later as the Conqueror, arrived at the city's massive Theodosian walls with an army that dwarfed the city's defenders. He brought with him a weapon that signaled the end of an era of warfare: massive, bronze cannons capable of shattering stone that had stood unconquered for a millennium. Inside the walls, the atmosphere was one of desperate, holy defiance. Emperor Constantine XI Palaiologos, the last of the Roman Caesars, knew the odds were impossible. The city was starving, its population had dwindled to a mere fraction of its former glory, and the hope of military aid from a fractured Western Europe had all but vanished. Yet, as the Ottoman drums thundered through the night, the defenders fought not just for a city, but for the very concept of the Roman world. The final assault came on May 29th. After weeks of bombardment and relentless waves of Janissary infantry, the walls were breached. In the chaos of the final breach, the Roman identity met its violent end. Emperor Constantine XI, refusing to surrender his crown or flee his people, is said to have cast off his imperial regalia and charged into the fray, disappearing into the carnage. With his fall, the direct line of Roman sovereignty, stretching back to Augustus, was severed forever. The fall of Constantinople was more than a military defeat. It was a seismic shift in the tectonic plates of human history. As the crescent rose over the Hagia Sophia, the psychological landscape of Europe changed overnight. The Middle Ages, with their emphasis on the Mediterranean as a Christian lake, were over. The center of gravity was shifting. However, as the Roman legacy died in the East, it was reborn in the West. The flight of Greek scholars from the falling city, carrying with them precious ancient manuscripts of Plato, Aristotle, and the classical poets, acted as a catalyst for a dormant intellectual fire. These refugees fled to Italy, planting the seeds of humanism and fueling the explosion we call the Renaissance. Furthermore, the Ottoman control of the traditional Silk Road trade routes forced European powers to look elsewhere. The blockade of the East compelled explorers to turn their eyes toward the Atlantic, inadvertently setting the stage for the Age of Discovery. Constantinople had fallen, and with it, the last physical remnant of the ancient world. But in its collapse, the dust settled to reveal the foundations of the modern era. The Roman ghost had departed, leaving behind a world that was no longer medieval, but something entirely new, restless, and profoundly different. 1400 AD, Europe. For centuries, the map of the continent had been a fractured mosaic of local loyalties. Power was not held by kings in distant palaces, but by 1,000 different lords in 1,000 different keeps. This was the essence of feudalism, a web of personal oaths, where a vassal owed service to a lord, and a lord owed service to a higher noble, creating a decentralized chaos that made national identity nearly impossible. But as the 14th century closed, the very catastrophes that had nearly destroyed Europe, the Black Death, the Hundred Years' War, and the Great Famine, began to act as a hammer, forging a new kind of state. The breakdown of the feudal contract was the first crack in the old foundation. The Black Death had decimated the labor force, giving peasants newfound leverage and shattering the absolute control of the manorial system. Meanwhile, the constant warfare of the Hundred Years' War demanded a different kind of organization. You could no longer rely on a fickle knight who might decide his personal loyalty to a duke outweighed his duty to a king. War was becoming professionalized, expensive, and massive in scale. To survive, monarchs needed something the feudal lords could not provide: permanent, standing armies and a steady stream of liquid capital. This necessity drove the shift from feudal power to centralized power. The era of the warrior king was giving way to the era of the administrator king. In France, the Valois dynasty began to consolidate a fragmented realm, slowly stripping the great dukes of their independent authority. In England, despite the bloody chaos of the Wars of the Roses, the crown began to emerge as the only institution capable of maintaining order amidst the slaughter. This wasn't just about military might, it was about the machinery of government. To fund these new ambitions, kings bypassed the traditional nobility and turned instead to a rising class of educated commoners, lawyers, clerks, and bureaucrats. These men did not owe their status to ancient bloodlines or landholdings, but to the king himself. They created tax systems, standardized laws, and built the administrative frameworks that allowed a monarch to project power far beyond the reach of his own sword. This period also saw the slow, inevitable marriage of the crown and the cross. While the church had often been a rival to secular power, the new centralized monarchs began to weave religious legitimacy into the very fabric of the state. The king was no longer just a first among equals. He was the divinely appointed sovereign of a defined territory. As we look at the maps of this era, the borders begin to harden. The blurry, overlapping jurisdictions of the Middle Ages were being replaced by the distinct silhouettes of pro-donations. The local lord was being sidelined. The knight was becoming an obsolete relic of a bygone age, and the concept of the state was being born. The era of fragmented fiefdoms was dying, and in its place, the foundations of the modern nation-state were being laid, setting the stage for a world where power was no longer a personal contract, but a centralized, institutional force. 1455, England. The air in the English countryside was no longer filled with the rhythmic sounds of the harvest or the tolling of church bells, but with the heavy, rhythmic march of armored men. The stability that had defined the High Middle Ages was fracturing. For decades, the cracks had been widening. The Black Death had decimated the labor force. The Hundred Years' War had drained the royal treasury, and the social contract between lord and peasant had been torn asunder. But now, the fracture was becoming a chasm. This was the beginning of the Wars of the Roses. To understand this conflict, one must look past the romanticized imagery of red and white flowers. This was not a mere quarrel between cousins. It was a violent, systemic collapse of the feudal order. On one side stood the House of Lancaster, symbolized by the red rose, on the other the House of York, bearing the white. At its heart lay a fundamental question of legitimacy: who had the right to sit upon the throne of England? But the true significance of these wars lies beneath the surface of dynastic ambition. For centuries, English society had functioned on the principle of feudalism, a delicate, decentralized web of personal loyalties. Power was held by great magnates, dukes and earls who commanded their own private armies, lived in fortified castles, and exerted near-total control over their local territories. The king was not an absolute autocrat, but rather the first among equals, a man who relied on the consent and the swords of his nobility to rule. The Wars of the Roses acted as a meat grinder for this old world. As the Lancastrian and Yorkist factions vied for the crown, they did so by mobilizing these private feudal levies. But the cost of this civil strife was catastrophic for the nobility itself. In the brutal skirmishes of Towton, Barnet, and Tewkesbury, an entire generation of the traditional aristocracy was slaughtered. The great houses, once the pillars of the realm, were being systematically extinguished. As the old bloodlines withered, the very mechanics of power began to shift. The chaos proved that the decentralized feudal system was no longer capable of maintaining order. The vacuum left by the fallen lords was being filled by a new kind of force, the centralized state. When Henry Tudor, of the burgeoning Tudor dynasty, finally defeated Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485, the medieval era in England effectively breathed its last. Henry's victory did more than just unite the warring roses. It signaled the dawn of the new monarchy. The power that had once been scattered among 1,000 warring barons was being pulled, inexorably, toward the center. The crown was no longer a prize to be contested by feudal lords. It was becoming the seat of a sovereign state. The era of the knight, the private castle, and the local warlord was dying. In its place, a more disciplined, more bureaucratic, and more absolute form of governance was rising. The Wars of the Roses had been a bloody, chaotic crucible, but from its ashes emerged a nation that was no longer a collection of feudal estates, but a unified kingdom ready to step onto the global stage. The Middle Ages were closing. The modern age was beginning. 1450 A.D., Lisbon, Portugal. The salt air of the Atlantic hangs heavy over a harbor teeming with movement, ambition, and a growing sense of restlessness. For centuries, the European worldview had been inward-looking, defined by the rigid boundaries of feudal estates and the spiritual confines of Christendom. But as the 15th century draws to a close, the horizon is no longer a limit, it is a challenge. To understand this sudden burst of maritime hunger, we must look at the walls that had long kept Europe contained. For generations, the Silk Road, the legendary artery of trade connecting Europe to the riches of China and India, had been dominated by middlemen. With the fall of Constantinople to the Ottoman Turks in 1453, the traditional overland routes became increasingly difficult, expensive, and politically volatile for Christian kingdoms. The spices of the East, the silks of the Orient, and the gold of Africa were no longer just luxuries. They were necessities for the rising centralized monarchies seeking to fund their growing bureaucracies and standing armies. Europe was hungry, not just for food, but for direct access to the sources of wealth. This era was driven by a perfect storm of technological convergence. The medieval world was finally meeting the tools of the modern age. The introduction of the lateen sail and triangular innovation borrowed from Islamic mariners allowed ships to sail against the wind. The refinement of the astrolabe and the quadrant gave sailors the ability to look at the stars and find their place upon a featureless ocean. Most importantly, the development of the caravel, a small, highly maneuverable vessel, provided the perfect vehicle for exploration, capable of hugging coastlines while also braving the deep Atlantic. Driven by a potent mixture of God, gold, and glory, the pioneers of this age began to push the boundaries of the known map. Prince Henry, the navigator of Portugal, became the architect of this expansion, establishing schools of navigation that turned the coastline of Africa into a laboratory of discovery. Explorers like Bartolomeu Dias would soon prove that the great southern tip of Africa was not an impassable barrier, but a gateway. But this was more than a mere commercial venture. It was a fundamental shift in the human psyche. The medieval mindset, which viewed the world as a static, God-ordered hierarchy, was being shattered by the reality of a vast, unpredictable globe. As ships ventured further into the sea of darkness, they were not just looking for pepper and cloves. They were inadvertently dismantling the old medieval order. The Age of Discovery signaled the end of European isolation. It was the moment the continent began to project its power outward, setting the stage for a global era of contact, collision, and conquest. The maps were being redrawn, not with the mythical monsters of folklore, but with the jagged outlines of new continents. As the sails of the great explorers caught the wind, they carried with them the remnants of the Middle Ages and the seeds of a globalized world. The world was growing larger, even as the medieval era was drawing to its close, leaving behind a legacy that would irrevocably connect the East to the West and the Old World to the New. 1492, Europe. As the Middle Ages draw to a close, the world looks fundamentally different from the fractured, tribal landscape of the 5th century. We often view the medieval period as a chaotic era of shifting borders, but beneath the surface of constant warfare, a profound transformation was taking place, one that would define the very concept of who we are. This is the story of how a continent of scattered tribes and Latin-speaking elites evolved into a collection of distinct nations, bound together by the power of language. To understand this evolution, we must look back to the wreckage of the Roman Empire. For centuries, Latin was the undisputed language of prestige, law, and the church. It was the universal tongue of the educated. But as the central authority of Rome dissolved, the spoken language of the common people, the vulgar Latin, began to drift. In the isolation of various Germanic kingdoms, this Latin began to mutate, mixing with the guttural dialects of the Franks, the Goths, and the Lombards. Over hundreds of years, these linguistic drifts crystallized into what we now recognize as the Romance languages. In the West, the Latin of Gaul slowly softened and transformed into Old French. In the Iberian Peninsula, it became the precursor to Spanish and Portuguese, and in the Italian territories, it retained a melody closer to its Roman roots. These were not merely different ways of speaking. They were the first boundaries of new cultural identities. However, the evolution was not limited to the descendants of Rome. In the north, the Germanic tribes, the Anglo-Saxons in Britain, the Saxons in Germany, and the Norse in Scandinavia, maintained their own linguistic lineages. The English language, perhaps the most complex product of this era, serves as a living map of medieval upheaval. It began as a Germanic dialect, was shattered and reshaped by Viking invasions, and was later layered with French vocabulary following the Norman conquest. This linguistic layering created a unique English identity, one that was neither purely Germanic nor purely Latin, but something entirely new. As these languages stabilized, they provided the tools for something even more significant, the birth of the nation-state. In the early Middle Ages, loyalty was local and personal. A peasant owed allegiance to a lord and a knight to a king. But as the centuries progressed, the shared experience of a common tongue began to create a mental community. When people began to read the same laws, hear the same sermons, and sing the same epic poems in their own vernacular, their sense of belonging shifted. They were no longer just subjects of a local duke. They were becoming French, English, or Castilian. This shift was accelerated by the most revolutionary invention of the era, the printing press. By standardizing spelling and grammar, the press fixed these drifting dialects into formal languages. It allowed ideas to travel faster than any horse, creating a shared consciousness across vast territories. The medieval era began with the collapse of a single, unified empire, but it ended with the foundation of many distinct, organized identities. The maps were no longer just lines drawn by conquerors. They were being etched into the very way people thought, spoke, and perceived their place in the world. The tribalism of the Dark Ages had died, and in its place, the modern nation was born. 1453, Constantinople. As the massive walls of the Byzantine capital crumbled under the relentless pounding of Ottoman cannons, the world was witnessing more than just the fall of an empire. It was witnessing the death of a thousand-year-old way of war. For centuries, the battlefield had been the domain of the elite. The knight, a mounted, heavily armored aristocrat, was the undisputed king of the medieval theater. To be a knight was to belong to a caste defined by land, lineage, and the expensive machinery of war. But the era of the individual hero was fading. The transformation of warfare from the knight to the soldier was not a single event, but a slow, violent erosion caused by three converging forces: gunpowder, the longbow, and the rise of the professional state. For much of the High Middle Ages, the knight was a mobile fortress. His heavy cavalry charge was a psychological and physical hammer, capable of shattering infantry lines through sheer momentum. This system was built upon the feudal contract, land in exchange for military service. However, this system was inherently decentralized and slow to mobilize. As the centuries progressed, the cost of entry to warfare began to shift. The first cracks in the knightly monopoly appeared on the muddy fields of Agincourt and Crecy. Here, the English longbowmen proved that a peasant, trained in the art of the bow, could strike down a nobleman from a distance. The longbow democratized lethality. It stripped the knight of his greatest advantage, his invulnerability in close combat, and replaced it with a terrifying, rain-like volley of arrows that ignored social status. Then came the true disruptor, gunpowder. Initially, primitive cannons were clumsy and unreliable, but they quickly evolved into weapons of devastating precision. The castle, the very foundation of feudal power, could no longer provide sanctuary against heavy artillery. When stone walls could be breached by gunpowder, the localized power of the feudal lord began to evaporate. As weapons became more effective and more complex, the nature of the combatant changed. Warfare was no longer a seasonal duty performed by landed vassals. It became a full-time profession. The demand for massive, disciplined formations of infantry, pikemen, musketeers, and arquebusiers required a new kind of organization. This required something the feudal system could not provide: liquid wealth. To pay for standing armies, kings could no longer rely on the fickle loyalty of lords. They needed taxes. This necessity drove the centralization of power. The transition from knight to soldier was, in essence, the transition from feudalism to the modern state. The battlefield moved away from the singular, chivalric duel and toward the massed, disciplined maneuver of the regiment. The knight, once the center of the medieval universe, was being pushed to the periphery, relegated to a ceremonial role as the era of the professional soldier dawned. The individual glory of the warrior was being replaced by the cold, calculated efficiency of the machine of war. The Middle Ages were closing, and in their place, a new, more organized, and far more lethal world was being forged in the smoke of gunpowder and the discipline of the pike square. Rome, 1500 AD. As the Middle Ages drew to a close, the dust of empires had settled, but the architecture of the soul remained. To understand the modern West, one must look past the knights and the kings to the most enduring, complex, and pervasive institution of the medieval era: the Roman Catholic Church. While the political map of Europe was a fractured mosaic of shifting borders and warring duchies, the Church provided something the kings could not: a singular, supranational identity. It was the only institution that crossed every linguistic and ethnic boundary, from the fjords of Scandinavia to the sun-drenched coasts of Sicily. In an age of profound instability, the Church offered a universal language, Latin, and a universal law. The Church's legacy was not merely spiritual, it was fundamentally structural. It functioned as the first great administrative machine of Europe. Through the development of canon law, the Church created a sophisticated legal framework that influenced the very concept of justice and jurisprudence. It established hierarchies, bureaucracies, and diplomatic protocols that would later become the blueprint for the modern nation-state. When kings sought to govern, they often looked to the Church's organizational models to manage their own growing territories. Furthermore, the Church was the primary custodian of intellectual life. While we often view the Middle Ages through the lens of darkness, it was within the walls of monastic scriptoria and the halls of the newly formed universities that the light of literacy was preserved. The Church did not just protect the classical texts of antiquity, it synthesized them with theology, creating a rigorous intellectual tradition known as scholasticism. This marriage of faith and reason, championed by thinkers like Thomas Aquinas, laid the essential groundwork for the Western tradition of logical inquiry and systematic debate. Socially, the Church provided the social glue that held a fractured continent together. It established the rhythm of life through the liturgical calendar, dictating when men worked, when they rested, and how they celebrated. It created a social safety net of sorts through the establishment of hospitals, almshouses, and orphanages, institutions that served as the precursors to modern social welfare. The concept of charity was not merely a suggestion, it was a codified institutional obligation. However, the Church's legacy is also one of profound tension. The struggle for supremacy between the papacy and the Holy Roman Empire taught Europe the difficult lesson of the separation of powers. The conflicts between spiritual authority and temporal authority forced a constant negotiation of rights and boundaries. a tension that would eventually evolve into the modern concepts of secularism and the checks and balances of governance. As we look back from the vantage point of the modern era, we see that the Church was far more than a religious body. It was the architect of European unity, the protector of its history, the educator of its minds, and the legalistic foundation of its societies. The Middle Ages may have ended with the rise of centralized monarchies and the dawn of the Renaissance, but the institutional DNA of the Church remained woven into the very fabric of the Western world, shaping how we organize, how we think, and how we govern to this day. 1350 AD, Paris. In the dimly lit corridors of the University of Paris, a scholar hunches over a parchment, not merely reading ancient texts but questioning them. To understand the modern world, we must first dismantle a common myth, that the Middle Ages were a period of intellectual stagnation, a long night where reason went to die. On the contrary, this era served as the essential, turbulent laboratory for the scientific method. The journey began in the shadows of mysticism. For centuries, the pursuit of knowledge was inseparable from the pursuit of the divine and the occult. Alchemy, often dismissed as mere superstition, was the misunderstood precursor to modern chemistry. To the medieval alchemist, the transmutation of lead into gold was not just a quest for wealth, but a search for the fundamental laws of matter. In their crucibles and alembics, they practiced the rigorous, repetitive processes of distillation, sublimation, and filtration. They were obsessed with the essence of things, and in their failure to find the philosopher's stone, they inadvertently discovered the properties of acids, the behavior of minerals, and the precise mechanics of chemical reactions. As the High Middle Ages progressed, a profound shift occurred, driven largely by the rediscovery of lost Greek wisdom. Through contact with the Islamic world, specifically the vibrant intellectual centers of Baghdad and Cordoba, Europe regained access to the works of Aristotle, Ptolemy, and Euclid. This influx of knowledge acted as a catalyst. It gave birth to scholasticism, a method of critical thought that sought to reconcile faith with reason. This was a revolutionary pivot. It taught the European mind that the universe was not a series of random miracles, but a structured, logical system designed by a divine architect, and that this system could be decoded through human intellect. This intellectual framework paved the way for the transition from speculative philosophy to empirical observation. No longer was it enough to simply quote an ancient authority. The new era demanded proof. We see this in the evolution of optics, where scholars like Roger Bacon began to study the nature of light and the mechanics of the eye, laying the groundwork for the telescope and the microscope. We see it in the burgeoning field of anatomy, where the taboo of dissection began to crumble, replaced by a desperate, driving need to understand the clockwork of the human body. This was the era where natural philosophy began to decouple itself from pure theology. The medieval mind began to move from the why of existence to the how of function. They began to measure the stars, to map the tides, and to catalog the medicinal properties of the natural world with increasing precision. While these thinkers did not yet possess the unified laws of Newton or the calculus of Leibniz, they provided the essential scaffolding. They transformed the pursuit of knowledge from a passive act of preservation into an active act of investigation. They moved the needle from the mystical furnace of the alchemist to the disciplined eye of the observer. Without this medieval crucible, this messy, beautiful collision of faith, ancient wisdom, and experimental curiosity, The scientific revolution would have had no soil in which to take root. The foundations were being laid, one observation at a time. 1450 AD, Florence, Italy. As we stand at the precipice of the modern era, looking back upon 1,000 years of European history, we must ask ourselves, what did the medieval mind actually see? When we think of the Middle Ages, we often conjure images of darkness or chaos. But to look at the art and architecture of the era is to discover a world vibrating with profound symbolism, technical ingenuity, and an obsession with the divine. The medieval aesthetic was not merely about decoration. It was a visual language designed to bridge the gap between the earthly and the celestial. For the vast majority of the medieval population, literacy was a luxury of the elite. Consequently, the walls of cathedrals and the pages of illuminated manuscripts functioned as a Bible for the poor. Every stone, every pigment, and every curve carried a weight of meaning. We begin with the evolution of stone. In the early centuries, we see the heavy, somber presence of the Romanesque style. These were the fortresses of God, thick walls, rounded arches, and small windows that kept the interior dim and contemplative. They reflected a world that was often violent and uncertain, providing a sense of physical and spiritual sanctuary. But as the High Middle Ages dawned, a revolution occurred in engineering. The transition to the Gothic style was nothing short of a leap toward the heavens. Through the invention of the pointed arch, the ribbed vault, and the flying buttress, architects achieved something once thought impossible. They stripped away the weight of the walls. They replaced stone with glass. When you step into a Gothic cathedral, you are not just entering a building. You are entering a vision of the New Jerusalem. The sunlight filtering through vast stained glass windows, the lux nova asterisk, or new light, was intended to transform the physical space into a spiritual one. The colors were not merely beautiful, they were transformative, turning ordinary sunlight into a kaleidoscopic medium that spoke of saints, martyrs, and the divine order. Parallel to this architectural soaring was the meticulous, miniature world of the manuscript. In the quiet scriptoria of monasteries, monks labored over vellum, breathing life into texts through illumination. Here, the aesthetic was one of intricate detail and vibrant color. From the swirling gold leaf of a psalter to the complex marginalia of a book of hours, medieval art sought to capture the complexity of God's creation. Even in the smallest illumination, there was a sense of cosmic order, a belief that every leaf, every creature, and every human soul was part of a grand, interconnected tapestry. As we move toward the end of the era, we see these styles begin to shift. The rigid hierarchies of medieval symbolism began to soften. We see the emergence of more naturalistic forms, a subtle nod to the humanism that would soon define the Renaissance. But even as the styles changed, the core impulse remained, a desire to use beauty as a vessel for truth. The medieval aesthetic reminds us that art was never a mere pastime. It was a structural necessity, a way to organize the chaos of existence and provide a window into the eternal. As we conclude our journey through the Middle Ages, we see that their legacy is not one of darkness, but of a luminous, soaring attempt to touch the divine through the mastery of stone, light, and color. Paris, 1492, or perhaps London, 1500, or Rome, 1510. The dates and locations vary, but the sentiment remains the same. The world as it was known for 1,000 years has fundamentally shifted. As we draw the curtain on this epic journey through the Middle Ages, a question often lingers in the minds of the modern observer. Why does this era, with its perceived darkness, its brutal wars, and its rigid hierarchies, matter to us today? To understand the modern West, one must realize that we are not living in a world that replaced the Middle Ages, but rather in a world that was built upon its ruins. We often view the medieval period as a mere waiting room for the Renaissance or the Enlightenment, a dark gap between the glory of Rome and the brilliance of the modern age. But this is a historical fallacy. The Middle Ages were not a pause in human progress. They were the crucible in which the modern identity was forged. Think of the very way you speak, the way you organize your society, and the way you perceive your own worth. The concept of the nation-state, the idea that people belong to a defined territory with a shared language and culture, was not a Roman invention. It was the hard-won result of centuries of tribal migrations, feudal consolidations, and the slow crystallization of French, English, German, and Spanish identities. When you look at a map of Europe today, you are looking at the ghosts of medieval kingdoms. Consider the institutions that govern our lives. The university, the very bedrock of modern intellectual life, was born in the medieval cloisters and town squares of Bologna, Paris, and Oxford. The legal frameworks that underpin our concept of rights and contracts evolved from the complex web of feudal oaths and the burgeoning merchant laws of the medieval city-state. Even our scientific journey, often credited to the Enlightenment, finds its roots in the medieval obsession with categorizing the natural world and the scholastic drive to reconcile faith with reason. We see the Middle Ages in our skyline, too. The Gothic cathedrals that pierced the clouds were more than just religious monuments. They were the first triumphs of engineering that dared to dream of reaching the heavens. They represent a human impulse to create something transcendent, something larger than the individual, a drive that continues in our greatest architectural and technological achievements. But perhaps most importantly, the Middle Ages teach us about resilience. We have seen a continent shattered by the Black Death, torn apart by the Hundred Years' War, and destabilized by famine and religious schism. And yet from that chaos, something new always emerged. The medieval era proves that human civilization is not a fragile thing that simply breaks, but a living organism that adapts, evolves, and regenerates through crisis. As we close this chapter of our history, do not look back on the Middle Ages as a period of stagnation. Look back on them as the era of foundation. We are the inheritors of their struggles, their faith, their artistry, and their triumphs. To understand the Middle Ages is not just to study the past, it is to understand the very DNA of the present.